And joining us now is Edward Ahmed Mitchell. He's an attorney and the Deputy Director for CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's the country's largest Muslim civil rights organization. Edward, thanks so much for making time, for being here today. How do you think these schools balance keeping all students safe, allowing protesters their right to free speech, and then also ensuring hate speech isn't a part of those protests? How do they balance all of that?
It's a very important balance to strike. Over the past few weeks, we've seen a large and diverse group of students across the country, Jewish and Muslim, Palestinian, Black, white, everything in between, coming together to demand that their schools divest their funds from the Israeli government because of its ongoing genocidal war crimes in Gaza. Those students have the right to speak up. They've got the right to engage in that long tradition of American peaceful protests and civil disobedience. Schools should respect that right. They should give kids the space to peacefully protest. And the last thing schools should be doing is calling in heavily armed law enforcement to brutalize college kids. We've seen this before during the Vietnam War. We're seeing it again right now, and it's got to stop. The balance to be struck is to let kids flex their muscles politically, let them speak out against what's happening, and don't brutalize them. And when graduation comes, this will all come to an end. But the key thing is to let kids enjoy their right to free speech. And yet there are kids that are afraid that some of the things that are being said, not all, to your point, there are plenty of peaceful protesters. We just saw them there with Polo. But in some cases that are saying things that really frighten Jewish students and make them feel afraid. And they say they're anti-Semitic. So where does the school step in if that starts to happen? Look, anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, all completely unacceptable. But the overwhelming majority of the protests that are occurring are not only peaceful, they are led by Palestinian and Jewish kids together, and there's absolutely no bigotry taking place. We've seen some inflammatory, unacceptable remarks made by rabble-rousers and agent provocateurs, usually off campus, right, trying to get their 15 minutes of fame. But the protests themselves have been respectful and peaceful, the vast majority of them. I think what we're seeing is that some anti-Palestinian groups want to zero in on a small number of people and try to paint all the protesters with that negative brush. That's very cynical, and it's not acceptable, and it does not reflect what most of these protests are about. And again, we saw this before during Vietnam when kids who protested were called communist and anti-American. You know, it's a very tried and true strategy. If you can't win the argument, you can't defeat the message, attack the messenger. So schools should, of course, condemn any hate speech that occurs, but they've got to be honest that for the vast majority of kids, they are not engaging in that at all.
And you mentioned some of those, what you call like rabble-rousers, but there have been some reports of people trying to kind of get their 15 minutes of fame or be a part of this, people that aren't necessarily students that are participating. What have you heard about that?
Well, look, I've heard the students themselves saying that, look, our movement is peaceful, it's respectful, it's multi-faith, multiracial, and the media and corporations and House Republicans and others should stop zeroing in on these rabble-rousers and agent provocateurs and pretending that they represent us, because everyone knows they don't. It's a small number of people. And they also note that this double standard doesn't happen with other protests. When the March for Israel occurred in Washington last fall, one of the speakers there was the notoriously anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic pastor, John Hagee. There were people in the crowd shouting genocidal things about Palestinians. There was no outcry about that, no House hearings about that. So it seems that kids who express support for Palestine are held to a very different standard than leading advocacy organizations and political leaders, and that's not fair. College kids should be addressed on the merits of what they're saying. We shouldn't be looking at these nuts outside of campus saying crazy things, because there are not that many of them. They don't represent the students.
Yeah, and what about the leader on Columbia University's campus? What do you say to his video?
So what I would say, you're talking about a student leader?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, if there's any individual student who has said something inappropriate, that should be condemned. And I think that is happening. I think students are making very clear what their message is. And sadly, they're being met with brutality. Across the country, we're seeing schools send in the police to attack peaceful protesters and even professors. As you know, I'm in Atlanta, and we had a brutal attack on students and professors at Emory University, and it's completely unacceptable, right? Schools can address protests in a respectful way, without brutalizing kids and without launching a smear campaign against these students, again, the vast majority of whom are peaceful, engaging in civil disobedience, and are themselves different races, religions, Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, others. So we've got to stop zeroing in on the small minority of people who may say something crazy, because we don't do that with pro-Israel protests. We've got to listen to what the kids actually saying and address the merits of that. They want the genocide to stop, and they want their schools to stop funding human rights abuses overseas.
All right, Edward Ahmed Mitchell, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.